Welcome to another edition of Podward State, Onward State's first and only podcast. I'm your host, Matt Ogden.
And I'm your other host, Matt Paolizzi. And folks, let me tell you, we got a scorcher for you today.
We have a fantastic sit-down with the UPUA student body president, Zachary McKay. We go through a litany of topics involving the coronavirus pandemic and its effect on Penn State as a whole, and the students coming back. Should they come back? We get Zach's opinions and more.
Yeah, just we got his take on recent events, just in general and everything, and what UPUA has been doing to support the community. It was awesome to talk to him. I hadn't met him before. It was just so great to talk to somebody who's really trying to enact change in the Penn State community in these trying times.
Absolutely. And this interview comes, it's recorded on Friday, and the interview
August
comes on
28th.
the heels of breaking news. Penn State's first update on their testing was revealed about 2 hours before recording, and they announced that 28 students across campuses, but that means 27 at University Park, 1 at a satellite campus, tested positive out of over 4,600 tests. So I think that's a good sign moving forward, but who knows what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, again, and some of the data is still being compiled, but we were able to get Zach's sort of initial opinion to that breaking news, which was really cool, and I think it'll be great for you guys to hear. So let's get into it. Alrighty, hello. Second episode of season 3 of Podward State, and we are joined by UPUA student body president, Zach McKay. Zach, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good, Matt. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for hopping on. We're also joined by associate editor and UPUA fangirl, Ryen Gailey. Ryen, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, guys.
Awesome. So let's get right into it. So first off, Zach, just tell us a little about yourself, where you come from, why'd you choose Penn State in the first place?
Sure. So I grew up in a far-off land called Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, just a few short hours from here. I went to Keystone Oaks High School, and in high school got pretty involved in things like marching band and theater. And so I actually came to Penn State to study theater as an acting major. It was a brand new program at the time. The faculty senate hadn't actually approved the Bachelor of Fine Arts program at the when I had enrolled. So I more or less took a leap of faith on the faculty senate that they would approve it. Little did I know that that was the first time I would have to place my hope in that the faculty senate would pass something. As I started getting involved more and more at Penn State, I found that student government was something that really interested me because as at the time I was representing the College of Arts and Architecture, and I'd heard a lot of students concerned about the fact that the rep who had served for 2 years was graduating, and there have often been gaps in that representation, and they were concerned about who would represent them, that there wouldn't be a voice. And of course, I was at the time the only one who ran for that role, so it was a pretty easy election that time around, and have been involved in student government ever since. There are a few other clubs, but I like coffee. I like talking really about anything. Big music fan. I love soundtracks, ironically. Maybe not ironically. I'm a big John Williams fan, and I don't know, classical music, all that jazz.
I see what you did there. So how did you meet your running mate, Lexi, and what made you guys decide to run for student body president and vice president together?
It's a great question. Lexi's one of my best friends. I met her that must have been the 13th Assembly. At the time, I was a member of the Committee on Outreach, which was just a subcommittee, I believe, of the Committee on Student Life. And she served as the director of it. The executive branch of the UPUA has kind of been more or less like an illusion. It hasn't really existed in a clear way before. So we really just had staffers on these committees, and she oversaw that team. And so having been on it as a representative, I got to work with her on different projects, and I really got to see her passion in things like World Cultural Week begin to shine. And so in the 14th Assembly, I ran for the Committee on Governmental Affairs chair. I kind of took over from Jake Riggs, who went on to serve as vice president. And then I served as Gov chair, and she ran for the chair on Outreach committee, which was still a subcommittee, but we were in the same room together, getting to work on those projects now as leaders, and could bounce ideas off each other. What was this? What was your leadership philosophy like? You know, what would you recommend doing in this situation? That was a really good period of growth. And sometime later in the 14th, obviously elections came around, or talk of elections came around, and what would end up happening. And we kind of asked ourselves, you know, where do you see yourself making the biggest impact? Where do you see yourself helping the most people? And it came down, honestly, like these roles they have so much potential to create so much change in such a short amount of time. And we knew that the dynamic between the two of us would just work really well together. And I'm incredibly excited to say that we haven't been proven wrong yet. Super excited to get to work with her on a day-to-day basis. She challenges me, and hopefully I like to think I challenge her to be better versions of each other each and every day. And so yeah, she's really cool.
So one of the big things that happened from this campaign, it was the first time ever that a UPUA campaign like this was conducted remotely, and also the first contested election for president since 2016. So with all those hurdles and complexities that were thrown at you guys, what did you guys do to stay on top of the campaign process?
Trying to find as much reliable Wi-Fi as possible, first and foremost. It was intimidating, right? This idea that we're going into a contested election the first time, as you mentioned, since 2016. I didn't know many people who had seen that election happen. I had only heard stories, things like, people just, the IFC is a big voting, it's not a block, but it's a big percentage of students in IFC vote. They're often encouraged from their chapter presidents and from the organization, as well as other organizations across the campus. And so we knew that going into it, we would need to kind of be aware of some of the politics, really like how different groups would get involved in the election and things like that. And so it was just a lot of phone calls, right? A lot of Zoom calls, getting to hear from those groups' leaders. We spoke often with the IFC president, Penn president, groups like the Veg Club, Eco Action, Eco Reps, so many really fascinating organizations, just day in and day out, getting to talk with those students and really hear what they wanted to see changed. One of the biggest things that we tried to do differently, even though it was the first contested election for a while, was bring about this idea of a living and breathing platform, right? This idea that you shouldn't come into a campaign on day one with 95 initiatives and say, hey, this is what we're going to do, end of story, come listen to us preach about our ideas. But rather, here are some ideas. These are what we hold most dear to us. There are pillars. And from that, we're going to kind of build this platform up from the ground with the input from students that we meet along the campaign. So it became much more of a listening tour, really, than anything else. And that really didn't change, even though we were virtual. We stayed up to date with a lot of the news. We would follow you guys, Onward State, quite a lot, and some of the other, news outlets that would cover the election, just to keep up to date as much as we could. And then we would often follow the elections website. There was usually a violation or two that would be filed each week, and so we'd kind of follow the from everyone, not from us necessarily or from others, but it was always interesting to see kind of like what the Elections Commission would think was a frivolous claim and what was not, and then where those violations were really going to end up as a sort of point violation or something like that.
Okay, so let's take it back to the beginning of the COVID-19 breakout, all the way back in March. You weren't elected president yet, but you were still a pretty important member of UPUA, I'd say. So my question is, like, as soon as the breakout happened and as soon as the shutdown of campus happened, like what was UPUA's reaction, and what were they really advocating for at the time?
Great question. We were slow, just like the rest of the country, just like the university. I was actually in class with a good friend of mine, Jiaru Shur, who serves as the International Student Council's representative right now. He was a member of the freshman council last year. And we had physics together, and I remember him telling me, Zach, this is like, my family is worried about this in China. We don't necessarily think that this is something that's going to be contained. Like, we need to be ahead of this now. And I remember thinking, it's probably not that real. I remember not that it wasn't that real. I remember somebody actually saying that we should start giving out masks, and that was so radical. People in their response, it was such a radical idea to be giving out masks, because what you would do is stoke the fear, is what these other reps would argue. And in reality, we just should have been ahead of it so much quicker than we really were. I just don't think the data was there. Frankly, I don't think there were a lot of people, the chain of command, if you will, that didn't take this thing seriously. But when it came time for, when push came to shove, the UPUA really worked hard to think of the students and how they would be impacted by this, especially the sudden switch to remote learning. And so things like alternative grades were pursued from the very beginning. We had begun discussing what something with regard to tuition would look like. Even now that's been one of the biggest topics, is the fact that, we're paying full tuition for an experience in where, we're, back on campus, but most of our classes are online. It's not that we're paying for the credits, but rather we're paying for an education, and the education is not the same. So why is it the same price? It was really, really cool to see how, together, how coordinated our advocacy could become, even in the middle of an election, because at that time, election season had begun, and people were very aware of who was running and who was not. And so on General Assembly nights, we kind of all set that aside and really pushed for the things that mattered. Alternative grades, there was a temporary halt on evictions and things like that we pushed for from the governor, which came out of Gov, I believe. It was a good time for advocacy, and it still is.
Right, Zach. So fast forward now to July, and we have the announcement about students coming back to campus in the fall. What was your initial reaction, and what was UPA's initial reaction to that announcement, and how did you guys think that was going to go?
Cautious. I was cautious. I wanted to feel surprised and excited at the same time, but I was most of all cautious at the fact that all of these cases were still going up. I'd had the time to walk around campus and see people already wearing masks. There were a few people out downtown who just wouldn't wear them. And my sort of first concern was compliance, was like whether or not, even if the university had all of these measures put in place, is whether or not people would follow them. And so we started taking meetings with the vice president for student affairs. He leads a group called the Student Leader Roundtable. It's really more or less like an informal group of students from like 40 orgs or something like that, where he just kind of comes to us and is like, what do the students think? What's going on? Like, how can I kind of stay on top of things and get involved? And that was sort of his connection to students while he was on top of things like the task forces that the university had put together for COVID. And so through that, we began to learn a lot of the plans that they had put into place, contact tracing. It all seemed pretty, we trusted a lot of it. And, a lot of it's still pretty good. As I'm sure you're aware, there's still some concerns that I have, but we were all pretty cautiously hopeful is how I'm going to answer that one.
How do you think this has tested your administration, since you're still going through the process of like internal elections and still building it up? I mean, you didn't meet formally over the summer, but how do you think this has tested kind of the strength and the durability of a new administration?
Really great question. It tests your patience and your ability to adapt more than anything else. We, even planning for the election, had, of all the contingencies that we had, and there were many, I'm a big contingency guy. We need to be prepared for this and this and this. If global pandemic was not on that list. And so, you know, Lexi and I would say are pretty similar in that our leadership styles are very get to know the people that you work with-esque. It's very personal. And so, you know, late night meetings talking about the meaning of life and philosophy behind different policy that's put forward, both in UPUA and in Congress, are always something that we look forward to. And so having that all virtual has been really, really tough. Our cabinet has been meeting over the summer and getting to talk kind of about the general structure of the executive branch and the organization as a whole. The steering committee, which is in the legislative side of things, have also met over the summer. And that's sort of how we've been staying in touch with the General Assembly. It's been weird. And I think what really sucks the most is coming back to it now. You know, we're on campus. A lot of students want to meet. And at the same time, one of the biggest things that Lexi and I had run on was transparency and pushing for accessibility, especially of the student government, as I think it should be, both transparent and accessible. It's kind of, it's weird not to think that. And so things like, you know, public meetings. I understand that there were some reps this past summer who thought, okay, well, maybe, you know, if our committee wants to meet, it's a committee of 10, 15 people at most, in person, we'll do it at someone's backyard, we'll have a fire, it'll be really nice. Yeah, that sounds great. But the trouble is important things happen at those meetings, and you can't just not have anyone take notes, or frankly, not even have anyone record what's going on and open it publicly, because they're all public meetings. And General Assembly meetings are the same way. There's a discussion now where some orgs are going to be able to use, if I'm not mistaken, the blue band field for meetings. I'm not too familiar on that, but I do know that there's talks about like a General Assembly being possible in the future. And we're still trying to figure out how to balance that in-person experience and at the same time accessibility and transparency. I'm all for, you know, bonfires and the like, but not at the expense of kind of hiding what we do until it's already done, and then ta-da, here's what we've been up to, student body.
So you've mentioned sort of the initiatives and regulations that Penn State has been putting in since the summer and have now been implemented for the fall. Things like mask up or pack up. In general, have these regulations made you more confident or less confident?
The regulations themselves confident. I think the messaging behind them less confident. And I've expressed that from the very beginning when they introduced the mask up or pack up campaign. I thought it was very aggressive. When I first read it, I was like, whoa, this is like, if I were reading this, just walking down the street, I'm going to think this poster is threatening me. And they had to explain that more or less it's not intended to get at the individual that's walking by and reading this and saying like, oh, wear a mask or we're going to, you know, box you up and ship you home, but rather wear a mask so that we don't have to pack up as a university, as an on-campus environment, and then go home. And frankly, I just think it was kind of confusing. We've seen a lot of confusing communication come out of Penn State's, I don't know if it's their strategic communications team or who's in charge of a lot of that stuff, but things like the compact, that was never run by us in any way, shape, or form. We would have been able to be like, hey, maybe you shouldn't include this piece here. The mask up or pack up campaign, I said I expressed my concerns there. I had pushed for, I don't even know if I can say this, but I will. Originally, they were looking at doing something different called, what was it? Do it for the we. Do it for the we was going to be the slogan. We were like, no, it just doesn't ring well. So I suggested mask up, like mask capital UP for mask UP, University Park. Simple, very short and sweet, and an easy hashtag, and not threatening. The trouble is it's not university wide, so Abington wouldn't have been able to use it. New Kensington, et cetera, all of our Commonwealth campuses. And so I guess this is a little more inclusive, still kind of harsh. And I think it's led some students to be kind of confused as to, what the repercussions of not following the guidelines are, what rights even they have in the classroom. For example, most classes, I think all classes are required to have an alternative to an in-person class. So if you don't feel comfortable going in, like that's not on you, the student, that's on Penn State to have that option available, because you shouldn't be risking your health and safety just to get your education. But I don't know if maybe there was a class out there that wasn't prepared to deliver that online course at the same time. I don't know if a student would know where to go first and be like, hey, this seems a little fishy. This seems like they're not sharing the notes while, I'm on Zoom. So I don't know if they've done a very good job with that. Walking around campus has been really interesting, though. I've found that most students are complying. I went on a little walk around or walk along, I guess, with a public health ambassador the other day, and we stopped probably 3 students at the most just around the hub, and we're like, hey, make sure you wear a mask. And everyone seemed pretty compliant. A lot of students were like, oh, I'm just sitting down. Can I not wear a mask while I'm sitting down? We explained, no, you have to be eating. Otherwise you should just wear it. Or if you're by yourself, obviously not within 6 feet of anyone, et cetera, et cetera. On campus has been fine. I think most people are following things pretty well. How do you think? Do you think from your experience, do you think people have been following these guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, so far I've been pretty surprised on campus. Most people seem to be obeying it pretty well. I think it's nice that, obviously the reason for it isn't that nice, but it sort of helps out how campus just isn't as crowded anymore. You don't have those huge crowds of kids walking to class every day. Everything's a lot more open, and that makes it a lot easier for people to stay socially distanced. And it also lets you enjoy the scenery a little better, I think, too.
I think it's interesting. I don't have any in-person classes, and I also live off campus, so I have not even stepped foot on campus since moving in a week ago. And I think it's interesting because we can sit here on our front porch and watch people walk by not wearing masks. And I would say more often than not, I feel like people, you see people walking by themselves, but we also see groups of people walking to frat row, not wearing masks or having masks tied through their belt loops, which obviously defeats the purpose. It's kind of like the sentiment behind it is there, they're bringing one, but they're not wearing one. So that's kind of what we've seen out here, at least off campus.
I personally am local, so I am from State College, and during the summer I was a little nervous, just from walking around downtown and not really seeing the compliance that I was expecting. But I would like to say that I am very surprised with how many people are complying. And when I do go on campus or when I do go downtown, there's just people wearing masks, and that is I wrote a story last 2 weeks maybe, and it was basically just saying hey, there's a town here and there's people that live here that aren't involved with the university. So for them, and be conscious of other people. And I would say I'm proud of the way that people are wearing masks and following that guideline, those mandates. So far, at least. Good.
That is something to be proud of. Yeah.
I kind of want to bring it back to what you said about how it was initially just mask up, and then they kind of added that little, or pack up to the end of it, and how that kind of adds to how the language in their messaging already seems to be they have this tendency to say that if you do go home, it's going to be because of the students. And I just want to know, do you think that's warranted to blame everything on the individual students?
So I get heated about this because it's become a blame game. Universities across the country are turning to their students. You didn't wear a mask. You're having parties. You're doing whatever in circles in East Halls. So you're going to be sent home, and it's your fault. Okay. And frankly, I think most universities have just lost the authority to do so. They knew that students, after the classroom experience, after they leave that on-campus bubble, are going to be engaging in those sorts of things. I was actually just talking with someone today, and they let me know that more or less the police in State College can't do anything about gatherings that are happening inside of houses because they need warrants and things like that, and it's just such a tedious process. And so they're really only stopping people that are like outside on porches and things like that in large gatherings. So I frankly think once the fall semester starts getting colder, and it becomes more and more of it will become more and more of an unsafe environment for students engaged in those things. And the university knew that they were going to engage in them to begin with. There was another good point that a fellow student had brought up about how Greek life has been a controversial, it's been a controversial love of the university, right? We love it when it brings students in and it helps bring in our alumni dollars, and they're so interested in supporting our students and all this, and it's great. But then when something terrible happens, we want nothing to do with them. Oh, these people don't, deserve to breathe. And the answer is no, you can't in the same breath welcome an entire community and frankly social experience on campus and advertise it as your own, and then just chastise it anytime something bad happens. At least I guess with regard to putting on a social in the middle of a pandemic. So I think there is individual responsibility that students have. Wear a mask, practice social distancing, just be smart. I mean, frankly, at Penn State, you're here for a reason. You didn't get in with without a pretty solid brain. So let's use it. And at the same time, let's, as an administration, not turn to those students who are going to engage in those things regardless, and say, oh, time to go home. The question that we should have asked, and maybe I'm just yelling at the sky because it's now in the past, is whether or not we should bring students back at all. That's a question which, frankly, I was never asked by the administration. I don't believe many students were ever really asked. There was a survey, as that went out that said, would you feel comfortable returning? That's very different from, here's what could happen should we do this. Because I think as leaders, you need to be able to think far ahead and say, well, okay, if this outcome brings us back on campus and we have a somewhat in-person experience, but you know what, 3 students are going to die, and you're going to have hundreds, certainly maybe thousands of students who are infected by this thing with implications that we don't even know of entirely yet. There was actually on Anderson Cooper just a few days ago, a conversation that he had with someone named Rosa. Rosa was a nurse helping patients with COVID-19. She had become infected herself, contracted the disease, and ended up falling into a coma. In the coma, she had developed blood clots in her hands, and her fingers had turned black and would most likely need amputated. I'm thinking about her, right? I'm thinking about the fact that there are students with conditions like that now. Yes, our death percentage rate is so small, but it's the longer implications that we're looking at now that we just don't have the data on. And it's more or less well, why are we subjecting our students to this more at-risk environment than we need to? I don't know. It was more of a question of whether or not we should come back. I don't think it's fair to blame the students now that we are back. Frankly, they made the decision to do it.
Across social media, you see a lot of blame being placed on students, but then it's those very students, such as RAs, who don't have sufficient training for something like this, aren't receiving hazard pay. I have a close friend who's an RA, and she said she said to me multiple times, this is not what she signed up for. Even just coming out of her building to go to class, she has to write people up for sitting in the lobby without wearing a mask. So I see both sides of the argument. I think everybody wishes we could stay and wants everybody to be safe, but then where you do place the blame on, we probably should not have come back at all. But then I'm concerned too, specifically about these students who are being forced to enforce these rules without proper training. I think that's a huge concern that we've heard as well, and is something that I think is, to be honest, extremely unfair for these people who signed up to be RAs and now have to go into the middle of a large gathering outside the commons and break it up. I think that's a huge concern that I think I have.
Yeah, it's me too. I've had RAs come to me and say, at least they've told me, I don't know what the numbers are, but they're saying that RAs are quitting left and right. And we're leaving entire floors of dorms unattended because you're right. They didn't sign up for crowd control. They didn't sign up to be hall monitors or cops. Frankly, many of them are just looking to help pay for college. Many of them are looking to lead their floors to success, or just kind of like be a good friend. I think that's, really what RAs are here to do. Nobody ever looks at an RA post and thinks, I'm going to go out and start yelling at all these kids. Maybe a few, but to those RAs, I don't think that's maybe the best way to go about your job. But you're right. I think you certainly can't criticize all students in the same breath, because you do have RAs like that. And I'm actually aware of the fact that coordinators too, who are more or less in charge of those RAs, aren't being given hazard pay either. Specifically, the coordinators who are tasked with moving students from their dorm to that Eastview isolation zone aren't even being given hazard pay. The public health ambassadors program here is, I think, paying $9.50 an hour. It's a good program. Great. We supposedly have 170 students who are going to go out in these bright blue shirts and hand out masks. But I think the trouble with it is that people have masks. People know where to find hand sanitizer. What we really need is people in our own organizations. We need people in our own smaller community groups to really be the ones who are more or less like peer pressuring each other to wear masks. It should be taboo to not wear a mask when you're with a group of friends or when you're walking around downtown. And I think it's just going to take a little bit of time for that to kind of kick in. I think it says a lot about the fact that we're putting students in harm's way to stop this thing. And that's that's the backbone of our entire return plan is student influence. And by influence, I don't mean that peer pressure. I mean actually getting in the way of large crowds at East halls and other areas. And it just seems a little flawed morally.
So shifting into some actually breaking news that's come out today, Penn State has finally announced the results of some of the testing they've been doing since the start of the semester. Currently, they've announced that 28 students across all campuses, not just UP. We haven't gotten full data for that yet, but 28 students across all campuses have tested positive this week out of 4,634 tests. I don't know if you've seen that news yet, Zach, or not, but just do these initial test results seem positive to you in any way? Do you think this is going in the right direction? Obviously, we don't have all the data yet. Everything hasn't been compiled, but just sort of some initial reaction from you.
I don't think we're testing enough. To be completely honest with you, even 4,600 is, out of the almost 100,000 Penn State students that make up the entirety of Penn State, whether it be at our Commonwealth campuses or here at UP. It just seems not very, maybe not very accurate as to maybe the numbers that are just not being reported. I'm also aware of the fact that the dashboard isn't being as updated as much as it should. I think it's only being updated once a week.
That's correct, yeah.
I think Student Affairs has talked about upping that. They're looking at some kind of a Monday, Wednesday, Friday update, which I think is helpful. I don't know why that wasn't sought after to begin with. You know, if there's ever a time that we should be pushing for transparency, it's during a public health crisis. But I don't know. I think I'll be thinking about those 28 students.
Fast forward to just last week, you appeared obviously on CNN with Anderson Cooper and talking about how you wanted Penn State to pursue action to send students home immediately. And I was just wondering, how did that interview with Anderson Cooper on CNN arise, and what was that experience like for you?
Thank you. So they had invited us onto CNN to kind of share our perspective. I think my opinion came from the fact that this is, you know, a matter of, unfortunately, like it's a matter of life and death. It's a matter of health and human safety. If things were, I don't know, I wish things were a little bit more black and white than they really were, because yes, it is a gray matter, especially being back on campus now. There's obviously a different opinion that a lot of students have about returning to campus or returning virtually now, given the fact that we're already here. I think there was a lot more drive behind the idea of just not bringing students back before we had done so. There were like 2 polls that Student Affairs and then President Barron had sought from student leaders on Friday of move-in week, which was like, should we stay the course? And in that, of the 40 some students who were polled, all presidents from Oregon and stuff like that, and student leader roundtable, only one person had suggested that we stay the course. And so at the time, it was definitely, you know, let's call it off. Let's call it quits while we can now. I think really it's just a matter of time. I think 28 cases out of those 4,600 leaves me with more confidence. It's still a matter of the fact that we are incentivizing in some ways coming back here. I understand that students had their own, you know, decisions and whether or not they'd want to return to campus in the State College area, but I think at the same time those decisions were influenced by the fact that there were in-person classes, and so by removing them, you would remove that incentive altogether, which might look different now that we're in class. But it was pretty crazy. As I was telling you guys earlier, you can't see their faces when you're talking to them live. So it was weird. You just had these voices in your head telling you, all right, you're going live in 1 minute. And I was like, oh my gosh. And the air conditioner was way too loud, so I had to run around my desk and go shut it down. Kind of nerve-wracking.
Zach, I'm curious if you think the university is being transparent enough with some of those pre-return to campus surveys where either the majority or all of students wanted to vote to change the course, or whether they're being transparent enough with how often they report the case data. So I'm curious. I find it ironic because I know you and Lexi worked so hard to maintain transparency, and that was a huge basis of what you ran on. And then I'm curious if you think that you're receiving that transparency, and if you think students overall are receiving transparency on kind of what's going up the chain of command.
I think so. In short, yes. I think they're being as transparent as they can be, given the plans that they have in place. And I think that plan includes things like testing 1% of our population every day, random sample, to my understanding. More than 70, if I'm not mistaken on this, and I might be, more than 70% of students weren't tested before returning to campus. I feel like I just kind of shouted that out there. I don't know if I heard that somewhere. Okay. So we'll have to look into it. But I think that the plans that they have in place allow them to be as transparent as they are now. but I think the testing should be upped. I think the rate at which they put out that data should be upped as well. It's odd to me that they wanted to wait like a week by week basis, because when we raised that concern, the first thing that went through my head was, are they trying to not be transparent here? Are they trying to kind of keep us here as long as possible because, if we keep looking at this dashboard and there's only 28 cases, yeah, why send students home? But maybe within that week, there are 3,000 cases that start happening. Maybe not 3,000, but a horror story, right? University of Alabama, 500 cases. I mean, that's something that we could all wake up to during one of those dashboard updates. And if it were from a week ago, I'd have a lot of transparency questions. But I'm hopeful in the fact that they've committed themselves to at least trying to find a way to increase that rate at which they put out data. I wish that they would test more students. And I wish that there was more repercussions, frankly, harder repercussions for those who do break the rules. I was pretty disheartened to think that the students at the fraternities who had hosted a get-together against the IFC's guidelines and against, obviously, university, state, and local health guidelines, were more or less just encouraged to required to get tests, but then encouraged not to do it again. We're seeing other universities. I think Purdue just started implementing an expulsion or suspension type punishment for students who break the rules in that sense. And I think that could be something that we look into. The difficulty is that now that we're back on campus, it seems sleight of handy, if you will, to then implement that change once you're already on campus, as opposed to having that in the compact, for example, before you return, and that you're aware of the fact that, hey, not wearing a mask could have you expelled, which it more or less does by signing the compact, because it says that you can be held to the student code of conduct, and in that code of conduct, you can obviously be expelled.
Like I said earlier, am from State College, and you're calling for students to be sent home. What type of impact do you think that might have on State College as a town beyond health reasons, and how that might affect the economy of local businesses and small businesses? And did you take that into account when you went on?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I study economics, so I know the impact that it would have would be dramatic. State College is a university supported town. The businesses that really thrive from students, you've already seen over the summer, some of them start to give out. And I think in many ways, obviously that's horrible, but in many ways it's because of a situation which none of us could have been prepared for. The decision to bring students back, I think, is in some ways a way for the university to say, in the event of an outbreak, hey, businesses, look, we tried, we brought students back, and you know what, the students just couldn't follow the rules, so we had to send them back, and you can blame them for going out of business. And I think that's what's most reprehensible about all of it, and that I've been pushing for from the very beginning. We can't just turn around then and say, oh, businesses, start blaming the students who have been enjoying your businesses for so long for breaking the rules and sending everyone home, and then thus breaking the economy, more or less.
And so just as a follow-up to that, how would you help students to understand their role in the State College community and their role that they have in the economy during these times? And how can we, as students, especially students that aren't from around here, be more aware of this town that is so dependent on them, like you said?
It's a good question. One of the things that we did, it was last year for the Committee on Gov Affairs and UPUA, was create a student's guide to State College. In there, we highlighted a lot of different businesses that accepted Lion Cash. I think it was just a list of businesses, really, for dining businesses, I guess. Some would call them restaurants. Anyway, some of them had Lion Cash listed on them. I would really like to see something like that for small businesses, locally owned small businesses that we give to our students and say, hey, this is a family-run business that's been here for years. Go order takeout from them. Try them out for, a Friday night meal with your roommates or something like that. So that in a way we start to encourage our students to give a little bit back to the community that we live in, because we're all here just temporary. We're all visitors, if you will. I guess not all of us, Sam, but I'm a temporary visitor. And so by contributing to the local economy, I think we not only obviously help those businesses, but help students feel as though they're part of a family that are engaged in helping those businesses survive too. The State College community is our lifeblood, right? We are so connected with this town and gown relationship that we've fostered over the years, and to just watch that die would be not only unempathetic, but just immoral. So I'd like to see something like that come from either the UPUA or the administration, just supporting small businesses.
I think that's a great idea. I really appreciate that.
Another issue we were talking about was how will this change life for upperclassmen and off-campus students? Like we've been talking a lot about what's been happening off campus, but then you have a massive population of students who are off campus. Where do you think the line is drawn there, and how do you is there any way, do you think, to regulate what students are doing off campus?
Yeah, through the borough ordinance, which is, a big step for them to have taken. It allows them to, I think, put a pretty heavy hand on the student population, which is unfortunately, I think, necessary during a time like this. But I think a lot of it's going to come down to, like I mentioned, that sort of peer intervention, not in a way where the university is hiring students to go out and get involved and engaged in unsafe conditions and environments, but rather each of us taking the responsibility to wear masks and then having the courage to tell your friends, hey, let's not throw this rager tonight. Let's wait a week or two or 57 until this is all solidified. And I think by then, I don't know. I'm hoping that our students' empathy will be really what stops this from spreading. Recognizing that this is far more about any one of us, that wearing a mask protects not just you but those around you, that going to socials on a Friday or Saturday night can literally only serve to hurt others. It's very selfish, it is. And so I think driving that home is really what's going to help our students with their, especially the upperclassmen, from realizing that this is less about them than I think they think, and that I think. I want a college experience the same as anyone else. It's my senior year. I'd like to enjoy it and have fun with my friends. But I realize that for our current freshmen and our incoming freshmen next year and for the next class after them, to have a good experience themselves, it's on us now to start taking responsibility to wear a mask, to tell others to wear a mask. So I think a lot of it's just that kind of a realization.
Yeah, and I feel like what you just said there plays perfectly into what we were just talking about with community awareness. Because living off campus means you're living in State College, you're a resident in the town for that time. And I feel like it'd be great for students to really sort of achieve that recognition that they're a community member for this time in their lives, that they're part of State College, and not just somebody who is, they're not just a Penn Stater. When you're living off campus, you're a resident of State College for that. And it's up to them to really sort of recognize their role in the community. And, it takes a village to get something as monumental as COVID recovery done. So I feel like you were saying, trying to encourage that involvement and to get students to really start thinking about their role in State College.
Definitely.
What's unfortunate to me, I think that, we can hope that a lot of students would take personal responsibility and have this awareness and empathy I think the mindset of a lot of students who live off campus as well. I live off campus. I pay my own rent. My classes are all online. So I think that mindset kind of trickles down to them having the mentality of, oh, well, if we go online, if we go remote, it doesn't really affect me. And what's scary and or upsetting about that to me is just because it is not going to affect someone personally. There are thousands of students who we have to worry about housing security or financial concerns or a home life that they can't return to. I think it takes a lot of empathy to get to that point. And I wish that more students had that point of view. Just because you live off campus and all of your classes are online doesn't necessarily mean you should stay. And I think a lot of students have this like bullish mentality of, I'm not leaving, you can't make me leave, I live off campus, that's why I live off campus. But it's such a bigger picture. There's so much more than that. There's a lot more students and a lot more scenarios to take into consideration.
Empathy is so central to what being a Penn Stater means, right? I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of the story behind We Are and where it came from. And I think really the idea behind it required empathy. It required us to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of others and say, hey, let's stand up to what's not right here. There's empathy required when you have to realize that that's not the full story. At the same time, Black students weren't welcome on campus. And so there's, right now, a need to have that empathy in a historical lens, yes, but really getting to know the students that you're with right now too, and recognizing that this pandemic is in every way something that is going to require empathy to tackle here in State College and across the country.
I was going to ask, what do you hope to see, or what would you like to see UPUA do to fight for some of those students who have housing security issues or financial concerns or an unsafe home life that they would have to return to? What would you like to see student government do to support those students if the university does close? Or what would you like to see the university do for those students? Because obviously it's not all just on our student government.
Yeah, if we could pass a resolution and stuff just happened, that would be awesome. But we've been supporting Lexi and I, at least in conversations, and I would hope that the assembly, well, we can get to our most recent assembly meeting in a bit, but pushing for exemptions to being sent home, right? Students, not all students can go home. Domestic violence is a very real threat. Not being welcome for who you are at your home family is a very real threat. I was just talking to somebody in QTPOC, a leader of QTPOC here on campus, where they would have executive meetings with students at totally random hours and at times separated, not necessarily all at once, because they couldn't just tell their parents, hey, I'm going to be on this meeting for this executive meeting for queer and trans people of color because I'm trans. That's a very real scenario for a lot of students at Penn State. And so Penn State, I would think, would need to offer an on-campus solution for those students in those dire situations. It can't just be a send everyone home and throw our hands up kind of thing either. At the same time, I think for should they move on or remote, I think the university should, as other universities have, work with, and if they work with landlords, and if the landlords won't work with the university, then fight the landlords to allow students out on their leases to get back home as well. Because on the flip side of things, you might have students who want to go home but can't because they're stuck here, paying rent in downtown State College.
Last semester, when campus closed down, UPUA fought for prorating of tuition. If they close down again, will UPUA be doing something similar and fight harder for lowering of online tuition for online class?
Yes, I've been encouraging that from the very beginning. There were a few reps who had worked on a piece of legislation from our last meeting that was sort of like an omnibus bill. That means it's one piece of legislation that covers a ton of things. It's a bullet point list of different ideas. And one of them in there was, I don't know what the language was, something about reducing tuition costs. I think that's, the point of student government. We should be pushing for those sorts of changes, especially now with tuition due on the 31st. Like Wednesday would have been the perfect opportunity. Instead, it was introduced as an omnibus bill, and I think the fact that it included returning virtually was what more or less killed it, and I think halted the UPUA from taking that important step and saying, hey, let's consider the fact that this quality of education will not be the same, regardless of whether or not we move back on campus, whether or not we return to remote learning, because we're virtually there right now. Virtually, haha. But I think especially when we return, if we return to remote learning, a similar resolution, I would hope to see somebody introduce a similar resolution, because I think that's the point of student government, is to really elevate your voices. And if that's something that students are concerned about, I would hope to see it brought up by a representative. That's the whole point. That's really been something I've been trying to drive home this year, is like, theoretically, right, that outreach subcommittee that I talked about, we wouldn't need an outreach subcommittee because it's the job of every representative to reach out and get to know students, right? The whole reason that we're looking to do things like press conferences and town halls this year is because we want to hear from the students, right? And so the theme that I'm really trying to push, at least within the assembly, is listening to the student body, especially in a time like this. So reps should be getting out and hearing from folks like you. They should be getting out and hearing from folks in their college and their clubs and even their classes. And if one of those things is, prorating tuition, I really hope to see some legislation out there. As a plug, you can find your contact, or you can find your representative's contact info on UPUA, well, on the website, upua.org. I don't know what the / is. But then go to the General Assembly tab and then representatives, and you can find who represents you and their email. So reach out to them and tell them what you want to see change.
Zach, to switch gears a little bit here, you were talking a little bit about the backstory behind We Are. And a couple months ago, during a 320 coalition, I took a picture of a student writing "racism and hate have no place here" in front of Old Main. I posted on Instagram and it went kind of viral, and later found out that student was you. So my question for you here is, with the recent surge for social justice, how do you plan on making Penn State a more welcoming environment for Black, Indigenous, and people of color? And what is your message to students who feel like they've been oppressed, treated unfairly, or have experienced racism during their time at Penn State due to the color of their skin?
To respond to the students who feel that way, first, those feelings are valid. I think too often we like to try and convince ourselves that, oh, well, maybe it's something else. Maybe they didn't mean this. Maybe, you're misinterpreting this. No, those are all valid feelings that not only Penn State, but the country, in many ways, just the entire, just the society that we live in, really, has perpetuated: racism, oppression, xenophobia, homophobia, etc. And I think that the first step is to admitting that and not trying to pass the buck. Okay, so what does that mean? Now that we're here, now that Lexi and I are leading the UPUA, and we have Stephen leading the assembly, and all of these people who are, especially in a time like this, so critically important to bringing about those changes, it's on us to get to know the student voices and what they want to see, and then interact in a way with administration, with administration in a way which can really bring about those changes. Things like diversity, equity, and inclusion and initiatives surrounding them have been pushed for from the UPUA before, but not really strongly. And so this past year, earlier this summer, I guess, when a good friend of mine, Nyla Holland, had reached out from Black Caucus and asked the NAACP and the UPUA to sign on to the Change the Code campaign. Lexi and I were on board immediately because I think too often the UPUA has been kind of like, oh yes, we stand for diversity, we stand for sustainability, but then is never diverse or is never sustainable, never pushes for those things in the university. But within a few days, we saw things like mandatory bias and discrimination training being required. We saw not just at Penn State, but across the country, stories that students have shared of their experiences here at Penn State, on Black at Penn State, and other organizational accounts like that. And we address them as an organization, but have a lot to do, a lot more to do. I think the university has a lot more to do, overarchingly as well too. I think students were watching the university to see what their response would be to a lot of those stories. I think maybe some of their responses may have come off as unempathetic, in that they didn't really provide much of an action step beyond what the Change the Code campaign had brought about. They really just pointed to that and said, hey, this is, yes, life as a Black student here at University Park has not been the best, and we acknowledge that, but look at what we've already committed ourselves to. Well, I think there's a layer beyond that where you have to say, maybe there's more that we can do. Maybe there's more that we should do. Let's have a town hall, and instead of just giving announcements, let's just only listen to students. Especially when we're talking about COVID-19 and the disproportionate effects on students of color and faculty of color. It's been such an interesting summer. So much has happened, but I don't know. I'm really hoping that the UPUA, at least through some of the examples that we're setting, will begin to take actual stances on things like anti-racism, and will commit themselves to social justice rather than just tossing around the diversity term and being like, oh, look, here's our diversity section. Rather, we're committing ourselves to just total anti-discrimination, anti-bias. We are, one of the things that we had run on actually this past year was supporting a bill which would, at least in Pennsylvania, ban all forms of hair discrimination. You obviously might know that there was a Penn State student last year, a football player, who was reached out to about his hair, and a Penn State alumni, I think, alumnus had said really, really terrible things about it. And I think when we start committing ourselves to that kind of good work, that kind of good trouble, as John Lewis once said, then as an organization, we become much less, pomp and circumstance student government, I'm the best, and more, all right, let's get down to business. Let's, really let's look at each other face to face from a socially safe distance. Hear what's happening from your perspective and take substantive action. That's really what I'm hoping to see the UPUA continue to do, is take substantive action on things that really matter.
Well, thank you so much, Zach, for that answer and for your time so far. As a way to sort of close this out, I'll give you the platform real quick. Anything you'd like to say at the end, especially to students who are listening to this episode of the podcast? What should they expect from you and UPUA as a whole going forward?
Well, thank you for listening. It's been really fun to be with all of you today. I'm really appreciative of your invitation, and I'm super excited to see all that the podcast continues to do and elevate voices that are bringing about change on campus. So best of luck to you. To the students who are listening at home or wherever you are, just know that this summer has been draining for each and every one of us. The feelings that you have that you have felt, the emotions that you have experienced, the hardships and pains which you have bore will in many ways shape your future, but that doesn't have to be in a negative way. As Penn State students, we truly are all one family. And although it might not always seem it, especially in those classes with professors who don't like to give extensions or who don't necessarily like to, frankly, just treat others with respect, know that the general population, especially here at UPUA, and from what I've come to understand here at Onward State, welcome you as our own, welcome you as family. You are welcome here, and by God, we will always fight for you as though you are family. I hope that you'll reach out if there are concerns, if there's something that you want to see changed for the better, because now's the time. This is a really, really unique time in our history as a university and as a country to bring about positive change that'll last our lifetime and then some. And now's the time to make your voice heard. We're ready to listen. So I hope to hear from you soon.
Again, thank you so much for your time, Zach.
Thank you so much for having us.
That's about it for this episode of Podward State.
And that was it, folks. Our interview with Zach McKay, UPUA student body president. It was awesome to talk to him. I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed sitting down and chatting with him.
So join us next week, folks, for episode 3 of season 3 of Podward State. Excited to give it to you guys. Catch you on the flip side for now.
See you until then.